The German soldier pressed himself into the hedgerow along the Normandy lane, hands shaking as he examined the American rifle. It was the morning of June 9th, 1944, 3 days after the Allied invasion had shattered the Atlantic Wall. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hartmann of the 302nd Infantry Division had discovered the weapon lying beside a fallen American paratrooper in a ditch near St. Margles. The rifle was unlike anything Hartmann had encountered in 5 years of war. Heavy at nearly 10 pounds, it had a distinctive wooden stock and an unusual en-bloc clip system. But what haunted him most was the memory of yesterday's skirmish near the village church. American soldiers, outnumbered and pinned down, had fired back at a speed Hartmann could barely grasp. They were not shooting in the careful, measured rhythm of trained riflemen. They unleashed rounds as fast as they could squeeze the trigger, 8 in rapid succession, then reloaded in under 2 seconds with a metallic ping that rang off the stone walls. Hartmann had been a soldier since 1939. He had fought in Poland, in France during the 1940 campaign, and endured the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. He knew rifles. The Karabiner 98K, the standard German infantry weapon, was second nature to him. He could operate its bolt in his sleep, cycle 5 rounds with practiced precision, and hit a man at 300 meters without thinking. Yet yesterday, facing American paratroopers armed with these strange semi-automatic rifles, he had felt something new. For the first time in the war, he had felt outgunned. The Americans were not braver, nor did they employ superior tactics. They simply fired faster, so fast that his squad had been forced to abandon positions they should have held. That evening, Hartmann's company commander, Hauptmann Dieter Vogel, gathered the survivors and asked a question that revealed their shared bewilderment. How are the Americans reloading so quickly? Are they carrying multiple rifles? No one had an answer. The notion that a single soldier could fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger without operating a bolt between shots defied everything every rifleman in every army had been trained to understand. But now Hartmann held the proof in his hands. This was the M1 Garand rifle, a weapon that Germany had not anticipated. It marked a fundamental shift in infantry firepower, one that would force German soldiers to rethink everything they knew about rifle combat. The question was not only how the rifle functioned, though German engineers would soon dedicate great effort to understanding it. The deeper, more troubling question which would haunt German infantry commanders for the rest of the war was simpler. Why had Germany not created something similar? Why, in a nation celebrated for engineering excellence and military innovation, were German soldiers still using rifles in the same way their grandfathers had in 1914? To grasp why the M1 Garand shocked German soldiers, one must first understand the weapon they carried and the doctrine surrounding it. The Karabiner 98K or Kar 98K was more than a rifle. It represented nearly 50 years of German small arms development, a system that embodied German military values, precision, reliability, and deadly effectiveness in the hands of a trained soldier. Its lineage began in 1898 with the adoption of the Gewehr 98 by the German Empire. Created by brothers Wilhelm and Paul Mauser, the original design established principles that shaped German rifle development for decades. It featured a bolt-action mechanism that was strong and dependable, capable of handling powerful cartridges. An internal magazine held 5 rounds, keeping the rifle balanced and streamlined. In skilled hands, it was accurate at ranges exceeding 500 meters. After the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles restricted German military forces, but the rifle evolved. By 1935, as Germany rearmed under the Nazi regime, the Wehrmacht adopted the Karabiner 98K, a shortened version of the Gewehr 98, incorporating lessons learned from the Great War. The K stood for Kurz, meaning short. At 43 inches in length and just over 8 pounds, it was still far from compact by modern standards. The Kar 98K fired the 7.92 57mm Mauser cartridge, a potent round with a muzzle velocity around 2,400 feet per second, giving it excellent range and penetration. A trained German infantryman could fire 15 to 20 aimed rounds per minute, cycling the bolt smoothly between shots. Exceptional marksmen, those with thousands of rounds of practice, might reach 25 rounds per minute in sustained fire, though accuracy would drop. The German army's rifle training was exhaustive. Recruits spent weeks mastering the bolt action, learning to maintain consistent trigger pressure between shots and to operate the 5-round stripper clips that loaded the internal magazine. They were trained to estimate range, adjust their sights, and account for wind and elevation. German military doctrine emphasized marksmanship because the rifle was viewed as a precision instrument. A skilled infantryman was expected to hit man-sized targets at 300 meters and engage targets at 500 meters or more when conditions allowed. This training reflected a broader German military culture that prized individual skill and professional competence. Soldiers were expected to be technically proficient with their weapons, understand their capabilities and limits, and operate as part of a combined arms team where rifles, machine guns, mortars, and artillery each had specific roles. The rifle was intended for accurate, aimed fire, while the machine gun, especially the MG-34 and later the MG-42, provided suppressive fire and area denial. This division of labor made tactical sense. The MG-42, capable of firing up to 500 rounds per minute, gave infantry squads immense firepower. The rifle did not need to match that speed because it served a different purpose, or so German doctrine dictated. While Germany perfected the bolt-action rifle, the United States followed a different philosophy. American military planners, drawing lessons from the First World War, concluded that volume of fire mattered more than individual marksmanship at long range. They wanted every rifleman to deliver sustained rapid fire without the mechanical limitation of cycling a bolt. The man who solved this problem was John C. Garand, a Canadian-born firearms designer who immigrated to the United States and worked at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. Garand was a self-taught engineer with an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. In 1919, shortly after the First World War, he began designing a semi-automatic rifle that would eventually bear his name. The development took 17 years. Garand tested countless operating systems, experimented with various gas mechanisms, and refined the feeding system. His challenge was to create a rifle that was reliable under battlefield conditions, withstanding dirt, mud, and extreme temperatures, while maintaining acceptable accuracy and being simple enough for mass production. By 1936, Garand had succeeded. The United States Army officially adopted the M1 rifle as its standard infantry weapon. The M1 Garand was revolutionary in several ways. It was semi-automatic, meaning it automatically ejected the spent cartridge and loaded a fresh round from the magazine with each pull of the trigger. The soldier only had to squeeze the trigger again to fire. No bolt to operate, no manual cycling, just aim and fire 8 times as fast as he could pull the trigger. The rifle used an N-block clip system holding 8 rounds of 30 /6 Springfield ammunition, the same powerful cartridge the United States had employed in the First World War. When the 8th round was fired, the empty clip ejected automatically with a distinctive metallic ping, and the action locked open, signaling the soldier to reload. A trained soldier could reload in roughly 2 seconds, insert a fresh clip, push it until it clicked, and the bolt automatically released to chamber the first round. The soldier was ready to fire another 8 rounds immediately. The M1 weighed 912 pounds loaded, slightly heavier than the Carabiner 98K, and measured 43 1 to 2 inches in length, nearly identical to the German rifle. But in terms of firepower, there was no comparison. A trained American soldier could fire 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute with the M1 Garand, more than double the rate of a soldier using a bolt-action rifle. And this was sustained fire, not a brief burst. As long as the soldier had ammunition and fresh clips, he could maintain this rate. The United States began mass production of the M1 in 1937 at Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms Company. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, hundreds of thousands had been produced. Production eventually reached around 4 million rifles by the war's end, with Springfield and Winchester joined by additional contractors including International Harvester and Harrington and Richardson. When American forces first faced German troops in North Africa in late 1942 and early 1943, German soldiers encountered the M1 Garand for the first time. Initial reports were scattered and often dismissed. Combat was chaotic, and distinguishing rifle fire amid machine guns, mortars, and artillery was difficult. But as fighting continued through Tunisia, then Sicily, then Italy, patterns emerged in German after-action reports. American infantry squads were generating far more rifle fire than expected. They maintained fire longer during engagements and seemed to have more ammunition or were reloading faster than German intelligence had predicted. The first systematic German analysis of captured M1 Garands occurred in the spring of 1943. Wehrmacht ordnance officers in Tunisia, preparing to evacuate as Allied forces advanced, arranged to ship several captured American weapons back to the Heereswaffenamt, the Army Weapons Agency in Berlin. Among these were multiple M1 Garands in various conditions, from nearly pristine rifles taken from supply depots to battle-worn examples recovered from the field. The weapons arrived at the testing facility in Kummersdorf, south of Berlin, in May 1943. Engineers from the Heereswaffenamt subjected them to the same rigorous evaluation they used for all foreign weapons. They completely disassembled the rifles, measured tolerances, examined the metalwork, and tested the gas operating system under multiple conditions. What they found was both impressive and unsettling. The M1 Garand used a gas-operated mechanism in which a portion of the propellant gases was diverted through a port in the barrel to drive a piston that cycled the action. The concept itself wasn't new. French and Soviet designers had used similar systems, but Garand's execution was exceptionally reliable. The rifle functioned in mud, sand, extreme cold, and required very little maintenance. German testers fired thousands of rounds through the captured rifles, deliberately skipping cleaning and routine upkeep, yet the weapons kept functioning. The en-bloc clip system, which German engineers initially assumed would be a weakness, turned out to be surprisingly efficient. Each clip held 8 rounds and could be loaded in a single smooth motion. As the rifle cycled, the clip fed rounds upward, and after the final shot, it ejected automatically with a clear metallic signal. Reload times were measured, and even a moderately trained soldier could reload the M1 in under 3 seconds, often in just 2. By comparison, reloading a Kar 98K with stripper clips took 4 to 6 seconds for 5 rounds. The numbers spoke for themselves. In a 1-minute firefight, a German soldier with a Kar 98K could fire around 20 aimed rounds under ideal conditions. An American soldier with an M1 Garand could fire 40 to 50 aimed rounds in the same time. The American soldier had 2.5 times the individual firepower of his German counterpart, and this advantage applied to every rifleman. A 10-man American rifle squad, all armed with M1 Garands, could produce 400 to 500 rounds of aimed fire per minute. A 10-man German squad with 8 men carrying Kar 98Ks and 2 carrying submachine guns could manage perhaps 200 rounds, and much of the submachine gun fire was ineffective beyond 50 meters. The report compiled by the Heereswaffenamt acknowledged the M1's clear superiority as an infantry rifle, but it also listed several concerns about adopting a similar weapon for German service. The rifle required precision manufacturing and very tight tolerances. It used more steel and required far more machining than the Karabiner 98K. Most critically, it consumed ammunition at rates German logistics could not sustain. This point was crucial. The German Army's ammunition production and distribution were designed around bolt-action rifles, firing 15 to 20 rounds per minute. Supply chains assumed each soldier carried 60 rounds in pouches and perhaps 20 more in reserve. Battles were expected to last hours, or at most days, before units withdrew to refit. Semi-automatic rifles would burn through ammo 2 to 3 times faster, demanding proportional increases in production, transport, and forward distribution. Germany's industrial capacity, already stretched by artillery shells, machine gun ammunition, and tank production, could not easily shoulder this burden. Ordnance officials faced an uncomfortable truth. The M1 Garand was superior to the Kar 98K in nearly every tactical situation. American infantry wielding these rifles had a significant firepower advantage, yet Germany could not replicate it, not for lack of engineering skill. German engineers had developed semi-automatic rifles as early as the 1930s. The G41, a semi-automatic rifle designed before the war, was produced in limited numbers but proved too complex and unreliable for mass issue. The G43, an improved model introduced in 1943, eventually saw wider distribution, but production never exceeded 400,000 rifles over 2 years. By contrast, American factories produced 4 million M1 Garands. The ratio was roughly 10:1, and even that understated the disparity, since the G43 went primarily to specialized troops, while every American infantryman, rifleman, and many support personnel carried the M1. This theoretical understanding of the M1's superiority became a visceral reality for German soldiers in the hedgerows of Normandy. The bocage, as the French called it, consisted of farmland divided by ancient earth banks topped with dense hedges. These natural barriers, some centuries old, created a patchwork of small fields separated by walls of earth, stone, and vegetation. The hedgerows were formidable obstacles, 6 to 8 feet tall, thick enough to stop vehicles, and offering excellent cover for defending troops. German forces, particularly the 7th Army defending Normandy, had fortified positions throughout the bocage. They understood the terrain favored defenders. Each field was a potential killing ground. Each hedgerow concealed machine gun nests, mortar positions, and rifle pits. German doctrine called for small groups of soldiers to defend each hedgerow, retreating to the next line when pressed, creating a defense in depth meant to slow any Allied advance to a crawl. In theory, this strategy should have worked. German soldiers were well-trained, battle-hardened, and fighting from prepared positions. American forces advancing across open fields toward fortified hedgerows should have suffered heavy casualties. But the reality was far more complex, and the M1 Garand played a central role. When American infantry moved across a Norman field toward a German-held hedge, they did not advance in neat lines as First World War doctrine would have dictated. They moved in small groups using fire and maneuver tactics. One group fired while another advanced. The volume of fire they generated was extraordinary. 8 American soldiers, each armed with an M1 Garand, could unleash nearly 400 rounds in a minute during aggressive fire. This was not precise, aimed fire at distant targets. It was suppressive fire designed to keep German defenders pinned while other Americans maneuvered closer. German soldiers in defensive positions found themselves trapped by this relentless fire. A German machine gun team might have superior firepower on paper. The MG42 could fire 500 rounds per minute, but in practice, the gunner could not maintain continuous fire under sustained attacks from multiple directions. To aim and fire, the gunner had to expose himself. If 8 American riflemen targeted his position simultaneously, bullets would either strike him or force him to take cover. The Americans could sustain this pressure far longer than the Germans could withstand. Unteroffizier Hermann Schaefer, a squad leader in the 353rd Infantry Division, wrote to his wife in July 1944 about his experiences in the bocage. The letter, later intercepted and translated by Allied intelligence, described an engagement where his squad of 9 occupied a hedgerow with good fields of fire. American infantry advanced across the open field toward them. Schaefer's men fired with their Kar 98K rifles and a single MG42, hitting several Americans in the initial volley. Then the American return fire began. Schaefer wrote that the volume of incoming rifle fire was unlike anything he had ever faced, even in Russia. The Americans were not firing in controlled volleys. They fired continuously, as fast as they could aim and pull the trigger. Within the first minute, his machine gunner had been shot in the head and 2 riflemen were wounded. The Americans had not charged, they did not need to. They simply kept firing until Schaefer ordered his surviving men to fall back to the next hedgerow. He estimated the engagement had lasted no more than 5 minutes. His squad had fired around 300 rounds in total. He believed the Americans had fired well over 1,000. This pattern repeated itself across Normandy throughout June, July, and August of 1944. German after-action reports at both division and corps level consistently remarked on the overwhelming volume of American rifle fire. Some officers blamed it on seemingly unlimited American ammunition. Others assumed American squads carried more automatic weapons than German intelligence had reported. A few sharp observers saw the real reason. The Americans had armed every rifleman with a semi-automatic weapon, and that single difference in firepower tilted small unit engagements in their favor. If you find this story engaging, please consider subscribing and enabling notifications. It helps us bring you more in-depth content like this. The psychological effect of facing an enemy with superior small arms firepower was cumulative and corrosive. German soldiers entered the war confident in their training, their equipment, and their doctrine. Confidence earned through victories in Poland, France, the Balkans, and the early stages of the Russian campaign. Their army had a reputation for tactical excellence, for achieving more with fewer resources, for winning through discipline and leadership even when outnumbered. But that confidence eroded when the tools of their trade proved inferior. A German infantryman knew his Kar 98K was an excellent rifle, accurate, reliable, and powerful. But he also knew, through brutal first-hand experience, that in a firefight with American infantry, he could not match their volume of fire. He would fire 5 rounds, work the bolt between each shot, reload with stripper clips, and repeat. Meanwhile, the American rifleman would fire 8 shots as fast as he could pull the trigger, reload in 2 seconds, and fire 8 more. This wasn't about courage or training or tactics. It was mechanical reality. The German soldier wasn't failing. His weapon was slower, and in combat, where fractions of a second decide who shoots first and who dies, slower meant deadlier. German troops developed a wary respect for the M1 Garand's distinctive sound. Its semi-automatic rhythm, faster than a bolt action, slower than a machine gun, was instantly recognizable. Experienced soldiers learned to take cover the moment they heard it. They also learned to listen for the metallic ping of the on-block clip ejecting, a signal that the American rifleman was reloading. Some German training manuals even instructed troops to count shots and attack during that brief reload window, though it was far easier to teach than to execute under fire. The most demoralizing part wasn't only the tactical disadvantage, though that mattered deeply. What cut German soldiers the most was the growing realization that their own industry and leadership had failed to give them equivalent weapons. They had been raised on the belief that German engineering stood unmatched, that their weapons were the finest in the world. Much of the time, that belief held true. The MG-42 was arguably the best general-purpose machine gun of the war. The Panther and Tiger tanks were feared across every front. German artillery was accurate, powerful, and well-coordinated. But the rifle, the tool every infantryman relied on for survival, was essentially a relic from the previous century. Refined, perfected, reliable, yes, but still a bolt-action design at a time when the enemy had already embraced semi-automatic fire. This gap created a jarring contradiction. How could Germany claim technological superiority when its frontline soldiers carried rifles that fired at half the rate of their opponents? Some tried to reconcile this by focusing on logistics. Semi-automatic rifles burned through ammunition, they reasoned, and Germany was fighting on multiple fronts with limited resources. Better to issue weapons that conserved ammo rather than ones that demanded more than the supply chain could support. There was truth in this idea. Germany's ammunition production was strained, but it didn't change the hard fact on the battlefield. American soldiers could shoot much faster. Veterans who had served since the early years of the war remembered something else. Germany had developed semi-automatic rifles before the conflict. The G41 had existed in small numbers. The improved G43 was finally being produced, but in quantities far too small to equip every infantryman. The quiet question spread through the ranks. Why hadn't these weapons been prioritized earlier? Why had production been diverted elsewhere? These murmurs hinted at something dangerous, an erosion of confidence in the judgment of military leadership. The consequences reached far beyond morale. German infantry doctrine had been shaped around the assumption that both sides would rely on bolt-action rifles with similar rates of fire. Their tactics emphasized maneuver, fire, and movement, timeless concepts, but far harder to execute when the enemy could generate twice the rifle fire in the same amount of time. German squads found themselves relying more heavily on machine guns, mortars, and artillery because their riflemen were outgunned in direct firefights. German military leadership recognized the problem but could not resolve it at scale. The G43 represented Germany's attempt to field a semi-automatic rifle comparable to the M1 Garand. Development accelerated in 1941 after encounters with Soviet semi-automatic rifles on the Eastern Front, particularly the Tokarev SVT-40. The G-43, introduced in 1943, was a reasonably effective weapon. It used a gas-operated system similar to the Soviet Tokarev, fired the same 7.92mm Mauser cartridge as the Kar-98K, and featured a 10-round detachable box magazine. But production was limited by industrial capacity and competing priorities. The Walther factory in Zella Melis produced the majority of G43 rifles, manufacturing roughly 400,000 between 1943 and 1945. While that number sounds substantial, it pales compared to the 4 million M1 Garands produced by American factories in the same period, or the 14 million Kar-98Ks produced by German and occupied factories throughout the war. The G43 went primarily to specialized units. Panzer Grenadier divisions, the mechanized infantry supporting tank formations, received priority. Elite infantry divisions on critical fronts also received allocations. Snipers used accurized versions with telescopic sights. But the average German infantryman, holding a sector in France, Italy, or the Eastern Front, continued to carry the Kar-98K. He would use it until the war ended or until he could no longer carry anything. These allocation decisions reflected Germany's strategic reality. By 1943-1944, Germany was fighting a defensive war on multiple fronts. Industrial production focused on tanks, aircraft, and ammunition for these systems. Steel, machine tools, and skilled labor were finite. Every G43 produced meant fewer resources for other weapons. German planners concluded that providing limited semi-automatic rifles to elite units offered more military value than attempting to re-equip the entire infantry. This calculation was probably sound given the constraints, but it ensured that most German infantry would continue fighting with bolt-action rifles while facing enemies, American, British, and increasingly Soviet, armed with semi-automatic weapons. German soldiers adapted their tactics where possible. Units equipped with the G43 used them aggressively, positioning these riflemen where their higher rate of fire would be most impactful. Squad tactics emphasized the machine gun even more, with riflemen serving primarily to support and protect the machine gun team rather than acting as the main source of firepower. German infantry became increasingly defensive-minded, holding prepared positions where fields of fire could be controlled and the advantages of semi-automatic rifles partially offset by careful placement and combined arms support. But adaptation had its limits. In meeting engagements, in unexpected encounters, and in situations where maneuver and rapid reaction determined outcomes, the side with superior firepower held the advantage. American forces, especially in the war's final year, grew more confident in winning small unit engagements. This confidence stemmed from both experience and training, but also from knowing they had better tools. Captured M1 Garands that German soldiers occasionally obtained became prized possessions. Soldiers who recovered these rifles from American casualties or supply drops sometimes preferred them over their issued Kar-98K, despite regulations against using enemy weapons. The risk was significant. Carrying an M1 Garand could cause a soldier to be mistaken for an American by his own side, particularly if heard but not seen. It also violated military regulations. Yet some soldiers accepted the danger because the rifle's firepower advantage was worth it. German officers generally turned a blind eye, recognizing that using captured M1s improved unit combat effectiveness, even if it complicated logistics and identification. Ammunition was the primary limitation. The M1 fired the 30-06 Springfield cartridge, incompatible with German weapons. Soldiers using captured Garands depended on acquiring American ammo, meaning their rifles would eventually become useless when supplies ran out. Still, for short-term combat effectiveness, the advantages outweighed the problems. The story of the M1 Garand versus the Kar-98K was fundamentally a story of industrial capacity and national priorities. The United States made a strategic decision in the 1930s to develop and adopt a semi-automatic rifle as its standard infantry weapon. This required significant investment in research, development, and retooling of manufacturing facilities. It demanded training an entire generation of soldiers on a more complex system and building a logistics network capable of supplying the vast quantities of ammunition these rifles consumed. The United States had the industrial capacity to make these investments. American factories, particularly those in the automotive industry centered in Detroit and the broader Midwest, possessed the precision manufacturing capabilities needed to produce complex weapons at scale. The Springfield Armory in Massachusetts and the Winchester Repeating Arms Company in Connecticut had decades of firearms manufacturing experience. When war production ramped up after December 1941, these facilities expanded dramatically, and new manufacturers joined the program. The numbers were staggering. Springfield Armory produced roughly 3.5 million M1 Garands between 1937 and 1945. Winchester produced around 500,000. International Harvester, better known for agricultural equipment, produced approximately $300,000, while Harrington and Richardson produced another $300,000. Combined, output averaged about 60,000 rifles per month during peak production years, roughly 2,000 rifles per day across all manufacturers. Each rifle required roughly 40 aldarlobi of steel, extensive machining, and assembly by skilled workers. The process included forging the receiver, machining the barrel, producing the gas system components, manufacturing the trigger group, shaping the stock, and assembling hundreds of parts into a functioning weapon. Quality control was rigorous, with each rifle tested before acceptance. The scale of this operation, repeated daily at multiple facilities for years, represented an industrial mobilization few nations could match. Germany's industrial situation was fundamentally different. By 1941-1942, German factories were operating at or beyond capacity, producing weapons for ongoing campaigns on multiple fronts. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 created unprecedented demands for equipment and ammunition. Tank production needed to increase to replace losses. Artillery production had to expand. Aircraft manufacturing competed for steel, aluminum, and skilled labor. Supplying armies hundreds of miles inside the Soviet Union strained Germany's transportation networks. In this environment, re-equipping the entire infantry with semi-automatic rifles was not feasible. Kar 98K production lines were established, efficient, and producing rifles adequate for their role. Shifting to G43 rifles or another semi-automatic design would have required retooling factories, training new workers, and accepting reduced output. German military planners concluded that they could not afford the temporary reduction in rifle production such a transition would entail. This was a rational decision given the constraints, but effectively locked Germany into a path dependency. Once the decision was made to continue Kar 98K production as the primary infantry rifle, altering course became increasingly difficult as Germany's war situation worsened and the nation shifted to defensive operations. Allied bombing disrupted both production and transportation, making a major retooling impossible. Germany would fight the war with the weapons it had, improving them where feasible, but unable to make fundamental changes to standard infantry equipment. The contrast with American production was stark. The United States not only produced M1 Garands in massive quantities, but also continually improved the design based on combat feedback. Minor modifications addressed issues identified in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy. Production techniques were refined to reduce manufacturing time and cost, while the supply chain ensured that spare parts, ammunition, and replacement rifles flowed to forward units with remarkable efficiency. By 1944, American military logistics could deliver a replacement M1 Garand to a unit in France within weeks of a requisition. German soldiers capturing American supply dumps or inspecting destroyed vehicles were consistently amazed by the sheer abundance of equipment and supplies. A German report from December 1944, compiled after the Ardennes offensive, noted that captured American depots contained more rifles, ammunition, and equipment than entire German divisions possessed. The abundance was not just in quantity, but also in the diversity of equipment, spare parts, specialized tools, and replacement components. Everything needed to sustain operations was available in amounts that seemed wasteful by German standards, but ensured American units never lacked essential gear. When the war ended in May 1945, German soldiers surrendered their weapons to Allied forces across Europe. Among the millions of Kar 98K rifles collected were the stories of the men who had carried them, soldiers who fought with weapons they knew were outmatched by what their enemies carried. These were not bad rifles. The Kar 98K remained an accurate, reliable, and well-made weapon even in 1945. But it was a rifle designed for a different era of warfare, and the men who carried it paid the price for that obsolescence. The M1 Garand, by contrast, proved so successful that it remained in American service long after the Second World War ended. American forces carried M1 Garands in Korea from 1950 to 1953, where the rifle again demonstrated its effectiveness in combat. It remained in limited service through the early years of the Vietnam War, before being fully replaced by the M14 rifle, essentially a selective fire evolution of the same basic Garand operating system. The M1 Garand's service life spanned nearly 30 years of frontline use, an extraordinary achievement for any military weapon. General George Patton, commanding the United States Third Army in Europe, famously called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. While this was typical of Patton's bombastic style, it held truth. The rifle fundamentally transformed infantry combat, granting every American soldier firepower previously reserved for specialized troops. It proved reliable across diverse conditions, from the deserts of North Africa to the winters of Europe to the jungles of the Pacific, and provided American infantry with a decisive advantage in small unit engagements throughout the war. For German soldiers who survived, the memory of facing M1-equipped American infantry remained vivid. Interviews conducted decades later with veterans consistently revealed respect for American firepower and acknowledgement that German infantry had been outgunned at the individual soldier level. Some expressed bitterness that German industry and leadership had failed to provide equivalent weapons, while others defended the decisions made, recognizing that Germany's strategic situation limited alternatives. All agreed that the sound of massed M1 fire, the distinctive semi-automatic rhythm, was unforgettable. German engineers had correctly concluded that the M1 was superior to the Kar 98K in almost every tactical situation. Yet this knowledge could not alter Germany's industrial reality or reverse strategic decisions made years earlier. The war was fought with the weapons each side could produce. In that contest, the United States held overwhelming advantages in industrial capacity, resource access, and technological implementation at scale. The story of German soldiers realizing they were outgunned by American semi-automatic rifles was not a tale of a single battle, but of countless small engagements, day after day, where German riflemen operated their bolt-action weapons, while Americans fired twice as fast. It was the story of technological and industrial disparity manifesting at the most basic level of infantry combat, of soldiers confronting the reality that courage and training could not fully overcome inferior tools. When Oberfeldweiler Klaus Hartmann held that captured M1 Garand in the hedge near St. Margals in June 1944, he held tangible proof of American industrial power and military planning. The rifle represented decisions made a decade earlier, investments in research and manufacturing, and a commitment to equipping soldiers with the best possible weapons. Hartmann knew, as certainly as he knew anything, that the weapon in his hands surpassed the one he had been issued. He understood that this small fact, multiplied across millions of soldiers, could help shape the outcome of the war. The cost of technological inferiority was measured not just in tactical setbacks or lost engagements, but in the lives of soldiers who fought with weapons they knew were inadequate, who faced better equipped enemies, and who died questioning why their nation's famed engineering prowess had not extended to the basic rifle. The M1 Garand did not win the war alone. No single weapon ever does, but it contributed to victory by giving American soldiers a tangible, demonstrable advantage in the most common form of combat, rifle firefights between small infantry groups. For German soldiers on the receiving end, each encounter with M1-equipped Americans reinforced the bitter lesson that Germany was losing the industrial war even as it fought on the battlefield. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, explore the other videos on your screen now.